Hello friends, it's Kayla. I read a lot of books in 2022 and I highlighted 10 of them in my favorites video. But there's another like 50 that I loved so much that I want to get a chance to feature. So we're going to talk about a lot of those today. I've always done this reading survey tag at the end of the year where there's a list of like 10 questions and you answer one book per question. And I've always listed like 3 to 5 books in each category. When I feel like the tag is meant to be more rapid fire and I just feel like it's not interesting enough. So instead of making that video better, I decided to drag it out even further and talk about even more books. And I put them in a bunch of different categories, so I'm gonna list 5 things for each one. There is unexpected favorites that I had, books that I feel like lived up to the hype, underread reads, in my opinion, unpopular reads, why I think they're unpopular, why I liked them. Then I'm just gonna list like 5 of my favorite romance and 5 of my favorite book club picks that I read this year, and then 5 that I would recommend for younger audiences, and also 5 that I want to reread. It's also a chance to reflect on my reading a bit for the year. I'm going to do a channel reflection for my channel members video-wise, but this for you is more book-wise. So, unexpected favorites and why. The number 1 is Circe. I got this recommended by a channel member, Pepe. I just didn't really love Madeline Miller. I also have no history with Greek mythology, so I didn't think it would be for me. Gratefully, I was wrong. It's about the goddess Circe banished to an island. It's about the relationship she has, her own personal development and things that she goes through, a big story of motherhood, and I just loved everything about it. A Curious Beginning by Deanna Raybourn was forced upon me by my friend Erin in my Cozy Mystery series. That's the one that I read it for. Even though it's historical and it's more of a slow mystery, didn't really fit with the vibe of the video, but that video was good for me because it made me pick up some other things that weren't necessarily cozy mysteries. I just didn't know if historical fiction in this type of story would be for me, especially when I heard that it was so romance heavy and I hadn't yet acknowledged that I was ready for romance in my life. So this is Veronica Speedwell, and she ends up being protected by this man Stoker, having to live with him, travel with him, pretend to be his wife. Tropes that I end up really liking. I just found it really interesting and I want to continue in the series. Then the other book that I read in that video that was such a win is Dial A for Aunties by Jessie Q. Sutanto, which isn't really mystery. She ends up killing her blind date, and then they work in the wedding industry, her and her family, and they have to cart this body around, hide it. It's very over the top and absolutely ridiculous, and it's not something that I could have predicted that I would have liked. Then I'm gonna put Recitative by Toni Morrison on this list because I had read a couple other Toni Morrison. Nothing was my absolute favorite. I don't have a huge knowledge of her backlist to begin with, but I saw this one in my indie bookstore as a short book, just on like the recommended stack when you walk in the door, and I picked it up, read it when I was reading a whole bunch of short things for this experimental video, and I ended up liking it so much. And I think that it is in part because there is an equal amount of Zadie Smith's book review. Essentially, half of this is a book review of Recitative, and then half of it is Recitative, which is this story of 2 women. One of them is black, one of them is white, but you as the reader don't get to know which is which throughout the story. And it's just about the various encounters that they have throughout their life. There is a lot of talk about race, how it's affected them, and it's just a really interesting experiment of a story. And then lastly, We Spread by Ian Reid, because what's the book called? I'm thinking of Ending Things. It's such a booktube darling. Like, everybody loves it so much, especially weird readers or readers who like weird things. It's just such a beloved, odd book, and I only gave it 3 stars, and I thought, well, that's okay, this author's just not for me. But I ended up picking this, and it was just my perfect amount of vague horror where you're very much in somebody's mind and she doesn't know if the situation she's in is safe or not. If I had done a top 20 instead of a top 10, this would have ended up in there, along with quite a few other horror books actually. Category 2 is books that lived up to the hype for me, so I'm specifically looking at mostly really highly rated books that come highly recommended. Now, of course, you could say that a book I already mentioned has a really high rating and I believe it lived up to the hype. And also, like, a lot of these categories could be mixed. Like, A Curious Beginning I could also include in the category of books that I want to reread the most. But these 4 on Goodreads have a really high average rating and just come highly recommended, and I believe they lived up to the hype. We've got Slewfoot at a 4.3 with 6,000 ratings. It's like a fairy tale witchy revenge story in a small town, the patriarchy is really explored. I thought it was just as good as everybody said. That's one of the only books that I read exclusively on audio this year. So if I had a category for most recommended audiobooks, that would be on there. Next, I have, oh, and it was recommended by my friend Katie, the audiobook. Notes on an Execution, which she also really liked, is in a lot of people's favorites list this year. Danny Kakofka, this has a 4.1 and 32,000 ratings on Goodreads. And this is about a man on death row. And it's mostly told through 3 perspectives of women whose lives have been altered by his life and just him existing in general. I don't think that this is the most incredible book I've ever read, but I think it's a really solid discussion and perspective, and it leaves so many things for you to think about after. If I had a category for most recommended for a book club, this would be on it. Then I've got In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, which has a 4.4 on Goodreads, one of the highest average ratings I've ever seen, with 82,000 people. This is a really difficult memoir to read. It's about abuse. It's very personal, and it's unique and poetic and creative. It's told in different vignettes about like dream house as legacy, dream house as appetite, where she explores various narrative tropes like second chance, natural disaster. We get her really dissecting the situations that she's been in. And then finally, at a 4.2 with 20,000 ratings, I didn't even realize how well loved this was. It's Men We Read by Jesmyn Ward. I picked this up on my own because I'd read some fiction from her, and I was trying to figure out if I should read more fiction or more nonfiction, because I read a commencement speech from her that was really excellent and decided to lean more into the nonfiction, and it was just really well told, very descriptive, atmospheric for being a memoir. It's about her life, but also 5 men who have died in a very short time period in her life, and how it affected her, a tribute to their lives and their stories, and also a critique of so many societal structures. And lastly, for this category, it's not really highly rated, but it comes highly recommended, and it has for years, and that's Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin. Everybody has told me for years that I will love this because I love books that feel like a fever dream. And every time I say that phrase, people are like, have you read Fever Dream itself yet? Because it's really excellent. And everyone was right. It's a short horror fever dream. It has a confusing synopsis, but I don't want to give any more away than what it says here, but it says it's a nightmare come to life, a ghost story for the real world, a love story, a cautionary tale. It's not overtly scary horror, but it's just very unsettling throughout it, not really knowing what's going on. There's a couple women, there's a couple children. It's also one that doesn't leave you with a lot of answers at the end. So if you want to take any recommendations here, that one's for a pretty specific audience. Shifting from really popular books, really highly read books, I want to get into books that I feel like should have a higher readership. Ones that are underread, not necessarily underrated, because the people who like them, the people who get it in their hands, the niche audience maybe that they have when they read it, they like it, but I need more people who are right for the book to pick it up. So I'm going to start with Glory by Violet Bulawayo. Outside of like literally being nominated for awards, it's strange how low the readership is of this as far as the Goodreads goes. And maybe I recommend it for more of my friends who are lovers of weird fiction as opposed to general fiction, because it's satire, it is animals as main characters, but they very much act like people. It's a critique of the Zimbabwe political history. It's written in an odd way, it's very interesting, and I just feel like some of the critiques that I see for this are a little unfair, considering who typically writes satire, the type of satire that becomes classic novels, yet this is not seen as the fantastic piece of work that I think it is. Next up is Out There by Kate Folk. All of the 5 that I've picked have under, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 readers who've logged it on Goodreads. This is a short story collection that's definitely not for everyone, and it's hard to categorize because it's like kind of sci-fi, kind of fantastical, but more so just a little bit weird. But they're not all equally weird. Some of them are very short. I just had a really good time with it. There's stories of like what it's like to get on a dating app and there are AIs on there, and then meeting the AIs in real life. There is this like hospital where people have this bone melting disorder. My favorite one in here is about a woman who finds a room in her house that she didn't know was there, or she gets access to. It's just fascinating stories from Cape Folk. Another short story collection, Uncertain Kin by Janice Lynn Mather. I just really enjoyed this, and I don't think I've ever seen anybody talk about it. It's a Canadian author, maybe that's why it doesn't have the same reach. And also I just know that short story collections aren't for everyone, but if you are a short story reader and you just like contemporary fiction, these are 18 stories following women in the Bahamas who are just like going about life, finding their place in the world. A lot of sadness, a lot of beauty, just really well written. Then I have Fish Swimming in Dappled Sunlight by Riku Onda, and I gave this 4 stars, but it's a really memorable read for me. I don't think it's gonna change your life, but it is this really fascinating psychological story. It's not horror, it's not thriller, it's not mystery. It's just this kind of torment of these 2 people in this one night together. Their relationship is ending, and they both think that the other is responsible for a death that occurred. And they're just trying to get the other person to confess. And I just thought it was really fascinating. Then I have Alice's Island by Daniel Sanchez Arevalo, and I think that this has been picked up by a lot of mystery, suspense, thriller readers, and it doesn't really give those vibes. So I would most recommend it to fans of, I'm gonna call it women's fiction, that is about women making a new life for themselves, moving to a new small town. She lost her husband, she has 2 young kids, well, she's pregnant at the beginning of the book, and she decides to move to this new small town because she knows that her husband had been there before. And once he dies, she finds out that he wasn't where he said he was. He's keeping these secrets. And so she goes and starts spying on all of these people on this island while she integrates herself into the community to find out more about him, to be closer to him, to just find her place at the same time. And I just thought it was so interesting the entire time. It's very slow, but a good book. Next, I thought I'd run through my most unpopular opinions of the year because I love reading books that have a really low average rating and just seeing why. And a lot of times I end up really enjoying them. So I'm not gonna include the books that I talked about already in my top 10. Paul Bear's Club and Death on Her Hands, which have incredibly low ratings. But the other 5 are Daphne by Josh Malerman, which I was a little surprised about because I feel like of a lot of Josh Malerman's, this one is a true horror. I know a lot of other ones that he's written are a little bit vague, a little bit weird. This one is definitely slower, and it is very internal monologue heavy and about anxiety. It's a huge metaphor for anxiety, but it is a slasher. Like, there is an ominous entity following this high school basketball team, and I think it was a good time. Another one is So Happy For You by Celia Lasky, which I definitely understand the low rating for. Let me see. Josh Malerman's had a 3.4. This one also has a 3.4, and it's just hard to kind of categorize, so I don't know that it's found its quite right niche audience yet. It's not a thriller, it's not a mystery, it's not a coming of age, it's not a friendship story, but it is all of those things at once. It's leading up to a wedding, it has bridesmaids vibes, but not as fun. More camp, more satire. Our main character is absolutely insufferable. She has a lot of opinions. She's aware of her over amount of opinions. She talks about how she doesn't know who she is without arguing with people and having strong opinions and without being angry about everything in the world. She definitely takes out that anger on everybody and anybody that she sees, but leading up to this wedding, she feels like the bride who's invited her, who she doesn't even know if they're really that good of friends, maybe she's out to get her and wants to kill her. But at the same time, it's just like these messy friendship dynamics, and it's also like her coming out story, and we're going back, and it's a slow story of her like growing up. House Across the Lake by Riley Sager has a 3.5, and I understand this one as well because it's a thriller mystery. This woman, she is spying on her neighbors across the lake. She saves a woman from drowning, and it just gets absolutely ridiculous and leans into horror territory, which I love. Things that just come out of nowhere and are silly. It's a good time. But also with the integration of a lot of tropes people don't love in thrillers, I get why this didn't hit for everyone. I loved it. Also with a 3.5 is Woman Eating by Claire Coda. A lot of people love this, but I think it's gotten in the hands of a lot of like paranormal readers as well who are expecting, as it says, like a vampire story. And while it is much slower, it's much more internal. It's not about death and destruction and action. It's just this like sad, slow exploration of this woman's life who is living without her mother for the first time, trying to find blood by herself. There's a lot of bloodlust. There's a lot of allegory for eating disorders. With 5,000 ratings on Goodreads, I think this is getting more into the hands of people who love it and appreciate it. And again, if I had a top 20, or even if I had a top 15, I think this one would have made it. Which is also true for the next one, the lowest average rating of them all, a 3.2 with Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. 100% understand this one. Nothing happens in here. It's a very slow book that says it's about an apocalypse, but it's not about an apocalypse. It is about this family who stays at this Airbnb. Another couple comes, and it's just their like dynamics. It's just weirdly, overly descriptive things that the people are up to independently, how they look, how they feel, what they're doing. The description is spent on that rather than describing how the world is ending. And it was just my perfect amount of vague oddness. Next, we'll do a rapid fire category, and that is just my favorite romance of the year. I don't know who I'm pitching these to or what category they're in. I just didn't get to talk about any of these in my favorites list because none of them quite made it. But these are the only romance I gave 5 stars this year. Honey and Spice by Bolu Babalola. It takes place on a college campus, and there's a podcast, and there's a fake dating situation. The Wedding Crasher by Mia Sosa, which is another fake dating situation where a girl ruins this wedding and then gets into a fake relationship with the groom for reasons. Then I have Sweet Hand by N.G. Peltier, which is set in Trinidad, just with this woman who runs a bakery in the sky. And I don't know much of the plot of this one. They just fall in love. How do I describe it better than that? Fool Me Once by Ashley Winstead, which is about 2 people who are kind of vying for the same position at a job. It's a second chance romance. They had a rough breakup in the past, and I just thought it was fun and interesting. And then The Bodyguard by Catherine Center, which is about a bodyguard for this famous actor. They have to have a fake relationship because he doesn't want his parents knowing that he has a bodyguard, so she has to pretend to be his girlfriend. Another rapid fire one, my favorite book club selections of the year. Just in case you haven't watched all the live shows, you aren't caught up on which ones I loved, which ones I would recommend. I don't know, it depends on your reading taste. Confessions by Kane Minato is definitely on there. This I talked about in my top 10 video. The House Across the Lake, which I already talked about, by Riley Sager. Also, You're Invited by Amanda Giatissa, which also is about a wedding. I apparently love wedding books, especially this year. And it's this like friendship story. It's over the top and silly with these interviews from wedding guests. The bride is missing. There's just a lot to follow, lots of little twists and turns. Then I have House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson, which I haven't really talked about the fact that I reread this a month after reading it for the first time because I was planning for the live show and I reread the entire thing and I bumped it from a 4.5 to a 5. This would be in my top 15 of the year if I had that list, and it's about a woman who's a blood maid. She gets invited into upper society to be a blood maid, and the job isn't everything that she expects it to be. And then I guess these two are tied. The It Girl by Ruth Ware and All Her Little Secrets by Wanda M. Morris, because I gave these both 4 stars, but compared to the rest of my book club reads, these were a standout. This is about a woman who works as a lawyer. Her boss dies and she gets his position. There's something insidious going on. And then The It Girl by Ruth Ware is a history of this friendship group, and then current day. There's a journalist insinuating that a murder that took place in their friend group, the guy who died in prison didn't actually do it, and so it gets all reopened. And then my favorite books for younger readers that I read this year, in case you subscribed to me back in the day when I read a lot more YA than I do now, or you're looking for recommendations for the younger person in your life, or you're my younger audience, I have these 5 that stood out to me. So for YA books, The Darkness Outside Us by Elliot Schrafer, I think is one that could transcend age in adults. I mean, I'm an adult. I enjoyed it. It is about these 2 boys, guys, I think they're 17, and one of them wakes up on this spaceship, doesn't remember how he got there, and the other guy is like barricaded away, and eventually they interact and they have to work together to figure something out. I thought it was really well done. Then The Stars and the Blackness Between Them by Janata Petrus. This is about 2 Black girls. I think they're also like that same age. One of them is battling an illness and one of them just moved to her town in America from Trinidad. They have very different backgrounds, but it's about like the love that they find within each other and their place in the world. Then for younger readers, Sometime in Summer by Katrina Leno is like lower YA. We have a main character who is 14, and this is just such an excellent book about a girl who is staying on the East Coast for the summer. She wants to like save her mom's bookstore from closing. Her parents are separated, and it's about her like figuring out her relationship with each of them. There's a little bit of magic in here too, and like kind of a twist. Then these ones are both middle grade. When You Trap a Tiger by Tay Keller. This is about a young girl who her grandmother, her hominy, is sick, and her family's going to stay with her at kind of the end of her life. And there are these stories about mythology. There's a tiger. There's just like beautiful learnings to be had in here. Will make you cry. And When Life Gives You Mangoes by Corinne Getton is a young girl who lives in Jamaica, and she has a tense friendship with a girl on the island, and then a new girl comes, and it's about her like finding herself, but also uncovering some like repressed memories. There is hurricanes happening, and she has to come to grips with certain things that have gone on. A little bit of a twist, but you can see where the story is going, and I just thought it was really well done. And then the 5 books I most want to reread, and perhaps we'll reread some of these in 2023. So at the top of my list is Where the Drowned Girls Go by Seanan McGuire, because I just love this series, and I can't wait to go back after reading. I think I'm going to read it, the entire series, in like a 72-hour period. I'm very excited to read the latest one. I think is it the 8th or the 9th? But this one I think is my favorite in the series, but I need to read them all back to back to figure it out. The Wayward Children series is a bunch of kids who, some of the books are set in magical worlds, portal fantasy. Some of them are set in this school where they're coming together, and there's like some mystery solving going on too. Cora and her kind of mermaid situation, I just love the storyline of. They're tough books to read. They're sad. They're so interesting. Then Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. I want to reread this because I said it was like one of my favorite horrors of the year. And I just wonder if the situation that I was in when I read this, when I was on a boat, we were sleeping like on the ocean, if that led to me giving this a higher rating, if the unsettling like vibe that I was in, and I really felt like I was a part of this book. She is in a deep sea mission. It's very claustrophobic, and then she comes back and her wife doesn't know like how to interact with her because she comes back a little bit different. I feel like upon reread it'll really solidify this as an all-time favorite, or something that was just good in the moment. And what else? Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. This is the kind of book that once you get to the end, you realize how the connections all work, and it would just be interesting to go back with the knowledge that you have. I hate pitching this because there's so many different storylines going on, and it's pretty short, so I would just recommend going into it, just picking it up if this seems like something that you would like if Emily St. John Mandel is for you already. It's about a plague. We're following plenty of different timelines, like one where people literally live on the moon, and then one when people were first starting to colonize North America. I thought it was fascinating, and I loved the connections, but I want to read it again. Then we've got Sorrowland by River Solomon, and this is so interesting because I feel like it's in my top 20 for sure, but I don't remember much about it. And like, besides the overall plot of this woman who's escaping this cult, the cult's not really part of the story. It's more like her living in the woods with these small children. Her body is changing. It's getting weird. And I don't know why I can't remember any specific like scenes or things that happen in here. Maybe I read it too quickly. Maybe she's got kind of a vague tone throughout that nothing feels like a standout, but I want to read this again. And then I feel similarly about A Children's Bible by Lydia Millett. I was reading so many rabbit-centric books in this month of reading, and this one was my highest rated, and I just remember loving it in the moment. It felt kind of Lord of the Flies. It felt like something I've never read before. We're following a group of children who kind of make their own society. There's a lot of focus on climate change and the difference between these generations because their parents just are not caring for them properly. So they go out and make it on their own, but it also ends up a little bit like Walking Dead vibes. Not with creatures, but just with like where they end up. And I really just want to read it again because I gave it a 4.5 in the moment, and it's another one that I feel like upon reread could solidify itself as an all-time favorite. I just need to take a little more time with it next time. I did have another stack of books that I wanted to mention, but I can't think of a category that I would fit these into, though a lot of them have a lot of things in common, or one main thing in common, which is a storyline of a woman like finding her own power, except for this one, Silver Under Nightfall by Rinch Pecco, which I would just recommend generally like to the paranormal, urban fantasy, vampire like community. I don't read a ton of fantasy like this, but I liked it so much that I feel like I should recommend it. So maybe that's what this stack is. My most easily recommendable books that I haven't already talked about in other sections. We're following a bounty hunter in here, but he's also part vampire, and he connects with other vampires and learns that all vampires aren't bad, but then they hunt down other vampire hybrid situations, and it was just really wild. And then these ones are what I was talking about a woman, you know, finding her place. And I think that in the past I have been not resistant to this type of story, but just didn't pick it up as much as I probably should and could have appreciated, because I find that as a wife and mother, especially when I was a stay-at-home mom, and when you look at lists that are for Mother's Day, like things to gift your mom, things that every, you know, young mother should read, it all leans a certain type of way and almost feels like this implication that stay-at-home moms are sad and bored and lonely and wish they hadn't gotten into this situation and like want a bigger, better life for themselves. And I've never felt that way. And so I feel like these types of stories that are about women finding their power have been for a certain audience, and I understand their purpose for it, but I often felt like it's not that I wouldn't enjoy it, it's that I don't want this to feel like the only type of book that I should be recommended as a young woman. But nowadays, I really appreciate this type of story and what it does, and I feel like I can recommend it to people who are looking for that. So Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows by Bali Kaur Jaswal is about a woman. She starts a writing workshop, and all of these women come and they don't even know how to write in English, so it's a different situation than she thought she was getting herself into. And then one of them brings an erotic book and they start sharing their own sexual like fantasies, and it's just a good time. Then The Women Could Fly by Megan Giddings I almost put in my recommendation for like underread things, because this is about a woman reconnecting with her mother and finding out she has like witchy powers. I thought it was really good. And then I just needed a chance to talk about Charlotte McConaughey, because I read Once There Were Wolves and Migrations this year, and they were both big wins, and they're about a woman in like a tough place in life, just trying to figure out her way, and she has a real passion for nature and biology. She in here is getting on this fishing boat, just inserts herself into the situation to follow these Arctic birds on their last migration. They're like near future. So in this one, there's not very many wild wolves left in the world, and she's moving to this small town, integrating them back into the community, but there's a lot of pushback against that. And then there's a murder that takes place. Maybe it was the wolves, maybe it was a person. She needs to protect her wolves and herself and her sister. Then The Cherry Robbers by Saray Walker was a real surprise to me. I just loved this so much more than I thought, because the first half was a little bit slow. I was waiting for it to really take off, and then it ended up having so many good messages, and it was so fascinating to follow. So we have this woman who, her sisters, her entire life, every time one of them gets married, they die. And it's happened like 5 times. It takes a very long time to get into all of that. And then you follow her in the future, where she is acknowledging that maybe she should tell her story. And the journalists who are looking into it, they want to highlight her family. They want to understand everything that happened. So it's like this horror, fairy tale, feminist novel, and it was just a really good one. And then The Change by Kirsten Miller, I've seen so many people talking about. This was a 4-star for me, but I feel like I could recommend all of these together, which follows 3, I think, middle-aged women, and they all each have a different magical power that they use to solve a certain string of like deaths of young women in their community. So that stack feels very like empowering for people, and that's something that I'm just appreciating more in my reading. So that's everything that I just wanted to highlight at the end of the year that didn't make my top 10, but like almost did. I would love to know if you plan on reading any of these, or I don't know, you've read any and you just want to share any thoughts down below in the comments, as you always do. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.